How's your not Thanksgiving going?
Oh, it's going fine actually. Yeah, it's pretty cold here, and but otherwise, I've kind of been preparing for this today. It's strange to go back and look at all these things I wrote,
Hmm.
months and months ago.
hmm Well, that's the
Try,
problem with books, I guess. It takes so long for them
yeah,
to get published that you've completely erased them from memory just to free up
exactly.
some extra RAM, and then you have to go back and reload them.
That's exactly right. Yeah, even though this was pretty fast, it's in the grand scheme of things, I think for actual books, because of how New Discourses was organizing it and organizing it with Amazon and all that. So it was pretty fast. But there's things that I wrote a year ago now that I was also trying. I've been writing a number of different things. I just wrote an article for the National Association of Scholars. And so and then I've written articles over the past year. So I tried to go through everything to try to come up with something, things that would summarize
Yeah.
nicely. And then
Well,
that would,
rather than summarizing so much, what's the theme? What's the general theme of what you're engaged in on this project?
the general theme. It's funny that the themes that come to mind are always these like woke themes, like resistance. And,
Well, I mean, when in Rome and it's burning, yeah, right?
yeah, yeah, I guess, I mean, resistance, pushback.
hmm
That's really that's the theme, ultimately.
Speaking of that, and just
Mm.
for the audience's benefit, we'll get into this, but you've just published a book called Counter Wokecraft, and it's incredibly incisive, and it breaks down things and distills things and sets up the strategies, well, the substance of the woke, the strategies of the woke, and then the counters. But because it's kind of a polemic, have you invested your attention into war games like Risk or Access and Allies or something like that? Do you have a history of that kind of thinking?
Um, I mean, I played Risk as a kid, but that's not. Yeah, you'll sense from within the book there. It's layered with technical terminology that's military in nature, and also espionage related. And that's I'm a big espionage fan actually, and so a lot of the initial thoughts about the book and the name and the term and a lot of the terminology comes from the espionage literature. John le Carré, I like an awful lot, and everything on Netflix that has the title "spy" in it somewhere I've seen.
Hmm. So
So
you're more
it's
of a Tinker Tailor Soldier spy rather than a James Bond kind of
yeah,
buff.
obviously, yeah,
W-
absolutely, yeah.
Where did that start? That the interest
Yes,
in that.
yeah. It started by surprise. One year, I was we were spending our holidays in Cape Cod, and it was very rainy, and we had a small child, and so we ended up at I can't remember Wellfleet, maybe the Wellfleet Library, and I was just kind of perusing, looking through the books, and then I saw John le Carré, and and then I thought, oh, I've heard of John le Carré. It always seemed like the kind of books that would be on your uncle's shelf that were large and that nobody read, but that everybody had. And so I thought I'd give it a shot. And then ever since then, I really I became quite enamored with.
What's the kind of the tone, the tenor, and the substance of Le Carré and that first book? What drew you into it and engaged you so much in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the tenor, the story is like all of John le Carré's story. There's two or three levels of story that are taking place that aren't revealed until the very end, which I think is typical of spy novels or of mystery novels or detective novels. And it's also interesting because those, especially those early books were really about what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, and he always had this funny relationship with, because he was a former spy, but he denied it, or he downplayed his role, so no one really knows what kind of role he had, and he was always cagey and mysterious when he talked about it, but also, it seemed like his knowledge and insights and the details that he had about spycraft and or tradecraft, as it's often called, actually, in the actual espionage literature. His knowledge of it just seemed so profound that it was difficult to imagine that he wouldn't have been involved in it in some way at that time. And so all those elements, I really liked those kinds of details, the bureaucracy of tradecraft, and how, some things would be marked with a certain stamp, and that would mean that certain people would be allowed to read it and not others. But, on the way to the mailroom, there was always someone who kind of peeked into the envelope who wasn't supposed to. And so there's this bureaucracy of espionage and tradecraft that I always thought was intriguing. And then there's also the stories about the Iron Curtain itself and what was taking place behind the Iron Curtain and how espionage played out. And then there's a lot of common themes in the espionage stories about the sacrifice of the family for the military cause ultimately, and there's always a character who becomes betrayed in the end by the establishment, by the intelligence establishment. And that's a very common theme in his novels, and you don't understand that until the very end. But then, all the stories behind the Iron Curtain and what life was like and what people had to do and what they didn't do, and it also ties in, that element of it ties in a little bit to many of the stories that you hear of people who had grown up behind the Iron Curtain and then who came to the U.S. And often their stories are like, whoa, what's happening now in this woke thing really reminds me an awful lot of what was happening there. And so that was intriguing to me as well, the relationship between a totalitarian society and authoritarian society, and the risks that we're facing now.
Mm-hmm. I don't know to what depth your knowledge is of the history of, just say, the Soviet Union, but what we're watching now is the encroachment through our institutions, kind of like a craft, and really strategic. Whereas I just suppose, but I don't know, that within Soviet Russia, it came from the top down. It was just kind of imposed. And then everybody kind of just naturally adapted to this new totalitarian, authoritarian psychology. Whereas now we're kind of being converted to it rather than it being enforced from the top down. So there's kind of a way that we get to see it advance in a way that maybe it didn't advance, or it kind of evolved spontaneously in the Soviet Union, but I don't know.
Yeah, so have you Rod Dreher? Rod Dreher has an interesting book.
Live Not by Lies, yeah. Exactly,
Live Not by Lies. And so there's a lot of interesting stories in there as well, and parallels. And, lots of people have drawn these comparisons. I think that's right. Like, once the revolution was launched, they were kind of able to take over the institutions pretty quickly, and then it was imposed from above. And there is also, obviously, the risk of making too much of the connections between those systems. Rod Dreher talks about soft totalitarianism for a reason. People aren't being taken out to the woodshed and shot in the middle of the night in front of their families. Like, that type of thing is obviously not taking place, luckily. So the parallels, it's more like spooky parallels. It's not,
history rhyming or something like that. Along those lines.
Exactly.
I like what you're bringing up about these stories, about the bureaucracy of it, and then somebody being betrayed by the establishment. Is that just that theme of, is it the true believer that ends up getting, beheaded in the end? Is that what a theme that happens? Like somebody who really believes in it is betrayed by the establishment, or just a regular player? And I'm just wondering, I'm setting up the stage to see if we can draw a parallel in the betrayal within woke spaces, specifically within academic bureaucracies, if that kind of betrayal is happening, or is it just a more of a kind of a betrayal of the original founding principles of the institution, rather than individuals?
Oh wow, yeah, those are profound lines of thought and questions. The betrayal of the individual and who gets betrayed in the John le Carré stories, if you think about the spy who came in from the cold, the person who gets betrayed there, he wasn't a hero, really. I mean, he'd done some good work and he'd done what he was supposed to do, and in some ways, he was discouraged, I think, and not at the top of his game, and he wasn't heroic, really. He was just someone who had done his job over time, and he'd done it honorably in a profession which is sometimes questioned to the degree to which it's honorable. But certainly, within this military context, and he was betrayed. He was almost taken advantage of, because he wanted to be able to perform a role more heroically. And they played with that, and they took advantage of it. And then in the end, he was the one who was betrayed. And so, but I don't think it's. I think if you're talking about a betrayal of the mission of the university, I think that's not wrong. But I wouldn't draw too close a parallel with the characters of the John le Carré novels.
In another weak parallel between Soviet totalitarianism and what we see as kind of a soft totalitarianism that's spreading through the academy specifically, is that it's very obvious, it's easy to see that the Soviets were really top down. There was a revolution very explicitly. There were leaders that led things very explicitly. There was a central command, and it was centralized. The Wokecraft that I see is puzzlingly decentralized. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? We use in your book, and I myself and James Lindsay have used the metaphor of the virus. Mm-hmm. But it's really odd because it's kind of totalitarian, and yet it's not centralized. It's kind of culty, but there's no kind of central leader. What do you think about that, or what are some of the quizzical natures of that help us kind of understand it better?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's not like there's a centralized power structure. It is diffuse. And it's difficult to understand who's driving it and why it's being driven. I mean, many people have come up with different. Oh yeah, and so the section in the book, there's a little chapter called the woke grand tactic, woke viral infection. That's like directly from James Lindsay. Yeah. After we first started talking about the book, he suggested adding a subsection like that. So it's not mine at all. It really is his. And but anyhow, just to kind of clarify how that ended up in the book. But I mean, it's hard. Many people have said this, that the woke ethos, the woke worldview, fills a role that previously would have been filled, I think, by something like a religion. So as we've become so atheistic, we've become so materialist, and there's these kind of Marxist strains which have encouraged both of those things over time, and that have attempted to discredit and delegitimize religion, and that I think has also happened naturally as a function of the advance of science and the scientific method, and what we've been able to do through technology. But it's hard not to see that that's one of the driving forces, really, that people are all of a sudden in a position where their whole lives they've been told that religion is ridiculous, asinine, for ignorance, and yet these people seem to be drawn to the morality of the woke worldview in a way that it's difficult to describe it without having a religious evocation. And I talk about that a little bit in the book, and the woke ethos and the fervor with which people seem to believe and adhere to the perspective.
You even use the word zeal.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it is zeal. These people are zealous, and they have something that they want to do. And even though there is no single person calling the shots, it does seem to have focused relatively narrowly on a small set of principles and ideas and axioms that lots of people seem to be able to get on board with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key axioms?
Well, the big three, as I see them. So, well, you can think about it in a few different ways. When I first was writing about this stuff, I had been listening to a podcast series, a really interesting podcast series. It was from 1991 and 1992, these lectures of a guy named Arthur F. Holmes. I think that's his name. He was out of Wheaton College, and it was, which was at that time, I imagine it still is, a liberal college where they teach liberal studies, and so they have a course, a year-long course dedicated to history of Western philosophy, and that's what this series was about. And so at the beginning, and I think you've been trained similarly, Benjamin. If you're from the podcast, I've heard you speak in. Often you're familiar with philosophical notions, and you have a philosophical perspective often. But so basically, from that, when I first started thinking about it, and one of the reasons why it crystallized with me, also. Because I've been reading this literature for a long time, trying to understand it, and which is kind of more easily said than done. And but whatever.
Intentionally so, some might argue.
Yes, yeah. Many have argued, and I think it's probably not inaccurate. And it ties into one of the principles that I talk about in the book, which is go unnoticed until it's too late. And so you can obfuscate, and people don't really understand, and they don't really notice what's going on. But anyhow, all that to say that I was thinking about this, breaking down the worldview, and as Holmes was talking about it in terms of metaphysics, epistemology, and then how those kind of flow into your political philosophy. And so that first little section is written a little bit like that. And the big three axioms are that all knowledge is socially constructed. So that's Lindsay or Pluckfrose and Lindsay's knowledge principle. And not only is knowledge constructed, but it's constructed in such a way so as to advantage the oppressors to the disadvantage of the oppressed. So that's the political principle. And then a third principle that I coined is the subject principle, and that's that individuals are really just a function, or primarily a function, of their identities, and they behave according to their identities, and there's only so much control they have over that. And so people themselves, knowingly or unknowingly, serve to perpetuate these existing power structures. And
there's no way not to.
Well, I mean, there's kind of a funny thing here, because the woke, in a way, like the whole story about being woke is being awakened to that particular principle, the subject principle, that we are subject to these things, and we have to be aware of it, and we have to be conscious and then behave differently. So once we have that identity consciousness, or the consciousness of the fact that we have been subjected, then we can fight against the structures that exist. And so there's a strange thing. It seems like it seems like a strange thing that they're the ones who think it's so important, but at the same time, it's key to their becoming awoken, or awoken. That's right, awoken and being able to resist.
Hashtag resist.
So those are the three. Yeah, exactly. So those are the three axioms as I see them, and those kind of blend, or they work into the political philosophy, or the ethos, which is. Well, I don't know how deep down this rabbit hole we want to go, but if we're thinking about like what the epistemology is and what the metaphysics are of it, that if you have a worldview like that, and I talk about this a little bit at the beginning as well, like what does that imply for what the world is really like? And so ultimately, we don't really know very much about what the world's like in theory, like if you look at the knowledge and the political principles, but in reality, with the woke worldview, you have to accept a certain number of things as being real. You have to accept that groups exist. You have to accept that people exist. You have to accept that identities exist. History. That's right. History exists. You have to accept that words exist and that language exists and that power structures exist. So there's a whole pile of things that you have to kind of latch onto as the bedrock of the worldview. And so it's one of these strange conflicts and contradictions as well within the worldview. Like everything's relative except for like these axioms. Yeah. But so you have this like world that exists. It's pretty crappy. There's people who don't have very much agency. They're subject to their identities, and they behave in such a way so as to perpetuate existing power structures,
or to somehow, if you're talking about the oppressed class, they don't necessarily always. Not everything they do is perpetuating that. Sometimes there's like a crying out or some sort of resistance that happens within their culture, which makes it sacred. Let's just say, I'm just reaching for the first thing that comes to mind, like rap music is sacred, and to be appropriated by white people is to do violence to this act of resistance, this rap music, which doesn't necessarily perpetuate, but it calls out and is a part of a cultural resistance to the oppressive power structure of white supremacy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the keys to being awoken, or to being awake. This is all of a sudden you're recognizing your subject status and breaking out of it. And that's part of the resistance. And that's also part of kind of the woke ethos, which is that, if you see the world in this way, then you have a responsibility and an obligation to fight against it. Mm-hmm. And fighting against it means, it ends up meaning delegitimizing, overturning, tearing down these structures of oppression. Except
for the ones that you believe in that allow you to do that. Like there's no, everything's chaos except for that one point of leverage, which would be your oppressed status or your oppressor status if you're a woke oppressor who's now prostrating oneself before the ideology.
Sure, yeah. And also the other things we were talking about before, all these other things that exist, the structures and the power and the language, and so a lot of what takes place in these, and I think rap is probably a good example of it. It's to the degree to which that movement, that movement, I think was quite spontaneous, the rap music movement. But there is an appropriation, foregrounding of words, of vocabulary, of ways of expressing oneself that were intentionally
subversive.
Subversive, exactly. Yeah, subversive.
Which would be probably in the form and the content. So with regards to content, a lot of vulgarity would be the easiest thing to point to. And then with regards to the form, this overstepping of the bounds from language into music and inverting regular music, which would have mostly music with some lyrics. Now it's mostly lyrics, some music. I'm just kind of throwing that together, but in the form and the content, there's subversion happening. Or in the critical lens, that's what you would probably draw from that form.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so there's vulgarity for sure, but there's also a lot of words that those communities where rap came from, that became popularized, and which people were proud of using. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can just go to the Urban Dictionary, and like half the words in the Urban Dictionary are from originally from a Tupac Shakur song or something. Mm-hmm. Not all of them, but there is an awful lot of words that were created, appropriated with pride, and as part of a cultural resistance that I think could be viewed through that lens. Although I don't think it was as intentional, or I don't think it was people who'd gone to Harvard Law who end up becoming rappers. I think it was, obviously a different type of motivation and spontaneity.
Mm-hmm. So, wow, we're just like shotgunning. All these different ideas are floating around.
Is it too much?
No.
Should we stay narrow? Yeah.
I love it. I'm just, my brain's just really activated and energized by this. So there's the epistemology. One thing that I wanted to speak about, because at the very, very, very end of the book, at the conclusion or even the afterword, you say that this movement you thought came from the 90s. You did more reading. It comes from the 60s. You did more reading. It comes from Hegel. You did more reading. And he said it probably comes all the way back to the Greek skeptics.
Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable just kind of unpacking what is it about the Greek skeptics and in the philosophical discussion that we're involved in that begins in Athens? What was going on there that is being replicated and expressed in the woke movement with the skeptics and then the counter skeptics, which would maybe be Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle?
Yeah. So, this is not my expertise or special.
I'm sorry to do this. Yeah.
It's okay. So anything that I say now is prefaced with that. I have things that I'll say. Hopefully they make sense. But the first part, I think the most. So yeah, just like you were saying, you start following it back, and how far does it go? I think it really starts with Rousseau. I think that's the break, and that it's a counter-Enlightenment break, just as the Enlightenment was getting started, or not exactly, like 100 years after it had gotten started, but certainly he was the most vocal, the most recognized, and the most effective counter-Enlightenment thinker that led to the forking of the Enlightenment vision, let's say, and. So I just want to mention one book that I think is really interesting that I learned a lot from related to this is Yuval Levin, Not a Time to Build, but The Great Debate. And so he looks at Thomas Paine compared to Edmund Burke. And he sees this division in American politics really originating from there, from a conservative compared to a what in the U.S. we call liberal. But so anyhow, that's interesting. So I think Rousseau is kind of more on the critical path, but it's hard not to see some of these ideas going back as far. The skeptics and the sophists, I think, almost more than the skeptics, partly because of their metaphysics and the idea that you can argue anything that you want, and there's
reality is created through consensus, right? Which, if you go back to where the sophists were operating, they were operating in a democratic or a proto-democratic society where debate made the decisions. And so I think that language and argument had a lot of effect within that society. And so maybe, and there's episodes within Plato that go into this, and I'm not a scholar, I'm just kind of pulling things up from my dusty memory, about the sophists being all about power, whereas Plato, or Socrates, through Plato, is trying to make that moral matrix a little bit wider by saying, okay, maybe there is power, but there's also truth, goodness, and beauty, and what are these other things going on? And so maybe the moral hierarchy that we see operating within the sophists is what you're seeing rhyming going on over generations, being that power is central, power is constructed, and there's a blank slate, and then the culture imprints these systems onto people. Sorry, I know I broke up, but...
No, that was fine. And I had this thing popped up on my screen, so I got distracted just at the very end there. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there's also the kind of cynicism of this, of what the sophists were criticized for being cynical. That ultimately, we're training you so that you can have influence, whether or not that influence is for the right reason. And this was just kind of what you were alluding to. And so I think there is an element of that. This moral relativity, and also argumenting around that and using the tools of argumentation and rhetoric actually to be able to push a particular viewpoint and not necessarily trying to get to the bottom of things.
That's a really good point, and you dedicate a significant portion of this book to just going through the different rhetorical techniques that they use, Mott and Bailey, Trojan horse. You go through the language, and you just make very explicit, insofar that can be explicit, and it's just a snapshot of what's going on right now. And what I've noticed is that they always change their language once a word it gets smoked out, right? Mm-hmm. So within Evergreen, you watch these different words, diversity and inclusion, and then it becomes equity, and then becomes inclusive excellence and student success. And so even though you're pointing to these words, there's probably the techniques beneath those words that people can recognize the pattern, even though the language is going to keep on changing because they have to change it.
Well, that's a really interesting point, actually, the adaptive nature of the language itself. It's funny because some of the words haven't adapted, like some of the key ones, like the word critical. I think it's extraordinary that it hasn't adapted somehow. It has remained there for as long, back until at least the New Left, that word critical started to become very important. And I thought that people had smoked it out, but it like you said, I thought that was a good expression, but I still see it being used and people still being duped by it. But there's one part of the book where I kind of allude to that, but now that you mentioned it, I wish I'd spent a little bit more time on it, getting at the dynamic or the mechanism underneath it, because there certainly is something there. And the way I talk about it in the book is to be on the lookout for these words. So the second you hear a word that is used in a context you haven't heard before, and it sounds strange and it makes you feel uncomfortable, that's when you should be going, oh, okay, hang on a second. That's a weird way to use that word. And that's exactly how these words become weaponized, and it's those contexts. And so I don't know if you would have seen this part, but I kind of go through a series of ways of categorizing what are explicit woke words, so that people can identify them. Like they have X's in them, or they're words that normally you'd think of as good, but that are used as though they were negative, And so, but yeah, that mechanism is true. I'm not sure what the next step is, because the words will evolve, and we have to keep an eye on that to make sure that that might be my next blog post.
Well, so when you're discussing, and your book is focused on academia, but you can definitely retrofit it to many other institutions. This is an institutional disease. It operates and feeds on. One of my friends who teaches at the Evergreen State College says that basically anybody with a boss will eventually become woke. There's something about the power.
Anybody with what? Sorry?
Anybody with a boss will eventually become woke.
Oh, okay.
He's really, really cynical because he works at Evergreen freaking College, and he's like the last man standing, more or less. But in your book, you say, okay, they'll start to take over these different disciplines or these different departments by advocating for critical rhetoric studies or critical. James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian called out studies as a woke advance. You call out critical something, critical this, critical that. And then you also do something very clever, which is really important that people need to know about, is that within the STEM or the hard science places, they can't really do critical engineering or critical physics yet, but they do physics and society, engineering and society. So it's like, it's like they can't help but declare the genus of these new kind of studies or these adaptations that they're putting in them, like some sort of tree frog or tropical bird. They can't help but dress it up with feathers, even by pluralizing words that don't need to be pluralized. I hear that a lot. Societies or community, well, not communities so much, but rhetorics, or something like histories.
History. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, it sounds like what you're saying is it'd be wiser for them just to kind of make the invasion and not announce it. And so if they were more clever, that's what they would do. I think that's a little bit what you're arguing.
I think that there's something about it where they can't resist doing that. I think that they're in love. They're in love. Basically, it's rhetoric, and it's a narcissistic rhetoric. So it really adores itself because it's righteous. The cause is righteous, and also it just has to dress up in a vestment. I don't know why. I think that it's not about being clever. I think it's about some sort of pride or narcissism or something where they can't resist language. They really love language because language creates reality. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah. That's definitely. It's funny because people like us, we often criticize that notion that language creates reality. But I think one thing that we've learned is that it does to a certain extent. They've been very effective at using language to create reality. Mm-hmm. And so that's a technique we have to be conscious of. And it's the preamble to one of the sections is this thing like take it seriously. Mm-hmm. And so, as I was, over the course of my career and my studies, I often came across these things and I was confidently dismissive of them, thinking, oh yeah, well, that's just kooky talk and it's not going to go anywhere and I'll just do something else and concentrate on the important things. And then I turned around and all of a sudden it had kind of taken over my world. So I think... So there may be a narcissistic aspect to it, but I think there's also the choice of words and the inclusion of words is important from this weaponization perspective, because you can't you can't really invade a discipline. You can't just go in there into engineering or into computer science, and then all of a sudden, once you're in. You can't just say, okay, no, things are different now. We have to be paying attention to equity in computer science or in engineering. And so, what I see happening a lot is that these words are put in place, and this is the classic example of the terribly complicatedly named tactic, the reverse Mott and Bailey Trojan horse, but where you have...
It's like he created a Kama Sutra of social justice rhetoric.
I like that. Yeah, or maybe more like a haiku. It's a social justice haiku. But anyhow, so you go in and you're an adherent to the critical social justice perspective. You think it would be great if it were in engineering, because engineering is too rules based or too liberal or too inherently racist or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And so you want to get in there. You want to be able to start influencing things. And so you propose to someone, oh well, it's really important in engineering. Something that we don't take into consideration enough is the relationship between engineering and society. And then the person who you're talking to, the dean of your school or whatever, is like, oh yeah, nothing wrong with that. I can't see why that would be a problem. Mm-hmm. And that's when, like, later on, after you've hired 2 or 3 more professors into this new domain, you recognize all of a sudden what society was meant to mean. And it's really society, in this case, it becomes weaponized, and society is having a critical perspective on engineering.
So society not as it is, but society as it should be and is, and then changing society and using or submitting all of engineering's capacities and powers to re-engineering society in order to affect the social justice equity agenda.
Yeah, exactly. So there's all these things that are packed into that one word, but if the word hadn't been used in the first place, it wouldn't be able to get weaponized later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think it's not just a narcissistic thing. Although I think there
Yeah,
is, to a certain extent, there is a kind of
it's a tactical thing.
narcissistic,
Yeah.
but there's also glee of being able to force people to use a word they didn't use before.
Yeah, I mean, it is. You don't break this up. You don't. I don't think you bring this up in the book. But just the coercive speech, or the the forcing of people to speak these words, especially with the pronouns, is one site of intervention. Because now it's not just about declaring your pronouns. It's about declaring that you will do what is expected of you in this new world order, which is now rearranging the world according to language, and the signifier of she and him, or her and him, or whatever, no longer point to what they used to point to. They now point to something that's completely divorced from what it was. And the entire inversion, that if you don't think through what those neo-pronouns are, or just elective gender signifiers, if you don't think through the implications of that, what you're doing is not just swallowing the ideology whole, but you're also you're also a part of it now. It's also
And you're
becomes a part.
perpetuating it.
Yeah, and you're perpetuating it. So
Yeah.
it's very insidious, clever, and it's something I just want to do. I think about that a lot, about being
Yeah.
forced to.
No, I agree. I mean, and there is, I mean, and this is part of a power play as well, and this glee of being able to force people
And sanctimony, yeah.
and sanctimony to force people to do things. I think that's an element of it. But there's also, gosh, what was that making? It was making me think. Oh yeah, there's a little subsection in the book called "Don't Let Them Use Their Words." And it ties in this issue. It's a little bit more complicated, but I mean, the one that we were just talking about with the pronouns and all that. But not necessarily. But often what happens is words. They'll try to insert words into documents, into speeches, into curriculum, syllabuses. The classic one and the kind of the most powerful one is inserting the words into hiring descriptions for jobs. Because I mean, ultimately the most that's the most effective and powerful move, is to be able to hire a woke professor. And so, and one of the mechanisms that is done to do that, or is to take these words and to put them into strategic locations, so that later on they can be used to justify the hiring of critical social justice.
That, and also with regards to diversity statements, you now get to see if people use the language correctly, if they are actually woke. It's basically kind of like some sort of seminary thing or sub rosa thing, or like drawing a fish in the dirt. You know, you can tell the woke by, now everybody has to write this essay about what you did for diversity, and how you write about that will show to what level you're, at least, and we should get into this, or at least touch on it. You kind of divide the classes from woke to woke dissident, and you go through all these different categories, from true believer to play along believer to whatever. I'm just going to go through it so people can mimic the language and not necessarily perpetuate it, but they won't stand in its way, right? So,
well, do you want me to talk about the different?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think there's a few. Yeah, at first I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to categorize them and along what dimensions, and I didn't, in the end, come up with one that was as elegant as I was hoping. I was hoping to be able to have a nice matrix and be able to put different people on all the different, along the different dimensions. But it didn't quite work out like that, and I ended up with 6. And I think there's obviously other ones that you could have included, but the way. The main ones are, so the woke are the people who are initiated and familiar with the critical social justice perspective. So these are people who are trained in universities ultimately, and they adhere to it. So they actually believe it. And those are the true believers, like you called them. And then there's this other category which stands next to them, and I call them the woke proximate. I just wrote a post where I call them useful geniuses, because they kind of perpetuate the perspective, but they don't really understand it. And often these are people who are trained, that are scientifically trained. so they don't have philosophical training very much, and but they're well-meaning people ultimately, right? And they care about things like equality, and so when they hear these stories coming out from the woke folks about prescriptions that are useful, like making sure that you cite people according to their skin color, they think, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. And but they adhere, but they don't really understand. They're not really initiated to the perspective itself. Mm-hmm. And so, that category of people, I think, I used to think that they could possibly be turned to become what I call dissidents or latent dissidents. So the latent dissidents are people who kind of don't know about the perspective. They're not initiated to it, but they don't agree with it either. But they're not actively against it. They just have this intuitive reaction, but they don't try to, they don't take it any further than that. And then there's the people who move into the dissident category.
They're activated.
Activated, exactly. Yeah, these kinds of, the espionage kind of, and I couldn't. I mean, if you've, I think I'm sure you've read it closely. So there are all these. I just couldn't help but include these little, what do they call that?
Nods to.
Nods and tongue-in-cheek allusions to espionage, but but another category I think it's really important is the opportunist. And these are the folks who, they don't really adhere to it. It doesn't really matter to them one way or the other. They just want to get the grant, but they don't know what it's about either. And they're, in a way, they're kind of the ones that can turn things. They can lead to the momentum of the perspective.
See, this is a side note, but. It's really, when we talk about combating something on a structural level, you need to understand different kind of personality traits and stuff. And there's a one mode of critique of the woke is to compare them to different mental disorders, or specifically the dark triad with borderline personality, narcissistic personality, Machiavellianism, da-da-da-da-da. So with regards to, I think that's useful, but it's not useful unless you're understanding the dynamics of the psychology and then using that to your advantage. Ultimately, that's what you want to do. Not just go around calling everybody crazy, but understand how they're crazy and then flip them by leaning into them. So with regards to the opportunist, somebody who's kind of cynical or basically Machiavellian, maybe kind of has some sort of a psychopathy or sociopathy. If you can incentivize the opportunist, because they're just working purely on self-benefit, more or less. They're saying that woke is the dominant hierarchy or is ascendant, so might as well play into it and get your own while you're doing that. They're not going to switch until their incentives switch too. So you actually have to kind of change the system before you can get them on board, or figure out a way for them to exploit the system, either to further and quicken its demise as it is by leeching all the resources out of it and depositing them in the bank accounts somewhere offshore or wherever, or showing that there's some sort of other reward by defeating it, some sort of nominal heroism involved, Sorry for the aside, but I'm just...
No, it's not an aside. I think that's right. I think it will be difficult to turn the opportunists as long as the incentive structures, like you described them, are pointing in the direction of critical social justice. And that's definitely what you see everywhere in the universities, from the funding agencies on down. You need to adhere. Often, you see these job descriptions go by that people have to demonstrate commitment, adherence, that kind of language, which is really spooky.
It is spooky, and it just kind of snuck up on us. I mean, if the Academy was demanding adherence to American principles, it would basically be fascist. But this is the same language. I guess it's not fascist because it's communist, but it's the same sort of openly, blatantly zealot or kind of religious. It's faith. It's all faith based in how you are supposed to adhere to it and proclaim it. It's just odd.
I think he's talked a lot. One thing that I think he's described really well is Marcuse and repressive tolerance. Marcuse's repressive tolerance really describes this type of thing, that you have one set of rules for the people you don't agree with and another set of rules for yourselves. Mm-hmm. And basically anything goes for the people who agree with you and have this same ethos and same political project.
Mm-hmm. So calling it hypocrisy doesn't work because it's just blatantly hypocritical, but its value, again, and I've described this, is that they can be the victim and the aggressor at the same time, as long as that always aligns with their ultimate goal. So the only thing that really matters to the movement is the telos, or is the end point, which would be once you investigate that, you're like, okay, this is pretty dark stuff. Equity actually means the destruction of everything in order for a retributive redistribution of power along the inverted axis of this prior hierarchy, right?
Yeah. And then, you don't have to go far afield historically to see not only that it's been tried, not just once, not just twice, but, we can count them in the last century. Depending on how many you want to count, but, certainly on one or two hands, and they've all had similarly disastrous effects.
Yeah, when the death count is in the millions,
yeah, exactly.
What are you supposed to make of that? And when you talk about solutions or counters, rather, to this, you give a list, and one of the counters you say is the historical example, or how did you phrase that? When you're trying to describe or defeat it in conversation.
I think a bad historical record, I think, is how it's one of the series of arguments to sow doubt in people who are let's say susceptible to the critical social justice perspective.
So speaking of that, how do people recognize those who are activated and want to be actively anti this stuff, or anti-woke or woke dissidents? How can they tell who they can pinpoint and begin to work on? Like, who do you concentrate on turning first?
Well, okay, so this is fun. The first part of that is basically identifying who's woke, because they're easier to spot than the people who aren't woke, and that has to do partly with the zeal and the fervor of the movement. They don't try to hide themselves. But people who don't agree with it will tend to be more quiet. So the first thing to do is to keep an eye out for who's woke, and that it's pretty easy to do. I've actually talked to people who've read the book and who have used kind of some of the techniques, and they're like, "Wow, it's so easy to tell who's woke." And I'm thinking about at departmental meetings or at faculty council meetings, all these types of things. It's pretty easy to identify quickly who's woke. The question afterwards is, where do the other people fall? And so, are they opportunists? Or are they, and so the ones you have to try to spot are the woke dissidents, or the latent dissidents. Typically the dissidents aren't difficult to spot either, but they're kind of like big mouths, and they're fearless, and they'll take on anything, and but there's not very many of them. There's a lot more of
they get flushed out too.
Well, sometimes, yeah, exactly.
They've been selected out over time too.
Yeah. So there's fewer and fewer of them, and but the ones who are the ones that I'm thinking of that are real woke dissidents are people like Gad Saad or Pedro Domingos. These guys haven't really been pushed out yet, and they're there, and you can see them. But the latent dissidents, or like the quiet dissidents, are harder to spot, and they'll tend to speak less. And there's kind of a series of different things that I go through. But one is identifying who is woke, and then after that, the people who could be dissidents are one of the elements is what they study, or what their research profile is, and typically or primarily, or someone in the social sciences, humanities, and what's the third one? The fine arts. They're dominant woke.
Yeah.
It's so if you can't really write them off, but there's a high probability that they'll be woke.
Well, when searching for woke dissidents or latent dissidents, it would be either, specifically in the humanities or the fine arts, it would be somebody who would be a comedian or cracks jokes, and the people who laugh at the jokes. I think that would be one tell.
And so who it's the people laughing who are the latent,
the people hidden? Who don't suppress their laughter, or if somebody tells a joke that's that it's funny, meaning that it releases the tension around the hierarchy of this ideology or pokes fun at it, that's the way to dissent within the fine arts is mockery or iconoclasm. Okay. Basically comedy and iconoclasm. And the people who don't actively, the people who get really mad or try to do the canceling, so you'll know the woke by the response to that. The more fervent the response, and then the more medium response, or the people who silence themselves or don't have response, you don't know them, but people who don't mind laughing at that are probably close to the basically the dissident.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm not so familiar with the fine arts, and so but yeah, I can see that as being a tell for sure. And so there's a disciplinary approach. That's one way to kind of start to triage people. And then even within the disciplinary approaches, there's the methodological approaches. So people who are quantitative are less likely to be woke.
Why?
Well, why? I think because people who use quantitative methodologies, they don't believe that everything is socially constructed. If you're you can count things, and you believe that things exist that you can count, and you can there's a scientific metaphysics, if you want, behind the people who use quantitative methods in a way that you don't have of people from the qualitative methods, and it's almost more about the qualitative side of things, because obviously in the old days you could be a qualitative social scientist and not adhere to like a woke metaphysics, but it seems like that's where it's had the most influence. And so the people who are and often they actually are quite, no, I don't do quantitative research, as though quantitative research was somehow poisoned, or
it's oppressive by its very fact of being invented by white male Western cis hetero doxics.
Exactly.
Whatever.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So that's in a way it's kind of like identifying the woke compared to and not being able to identify the ones who aren't woke, but kind of process of elimination.
Yeah. Well, so there's a disagreeableness that you can find in the dissidents and the woke. The either end, there's going to be a disagreeableness within their demeanor. People who aren't disagreeable, it's harder to tell where they land, because you actually have to get them to express what they believe. And there's different ways of doing that. Over the course of me doing these interviews and investigating this, and always asking, well, what makes you resistant to that? It's usually critical thinking, whatever that means. And I don't know exactly what that means, but there's some sort of light in people's eyes in the way that they approach data or belief or anything. They want to engage with it in a complex way. They don't mind taking things apart. They have the ability to hold more than one perspective without necessarily having cognitive dissonance, which would be not understanding that you're holding two conflicting things, but able to, devil's advocate things. There's other just rhetorical skills or thinking skills that
those are good. Yeah.
Form some sort of distance between those who just believe or go along with belief, and those who want to interact with belief.
With ideas and test things out, and not be afraid to consider other possibilities instead of having a prejudged conclusion. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The some of the other things that I'm just trying to remember. There's one about the words that they use. So if people use the crossover words, it's hard to know where they stand on things.
Explain the crossover words. This is a really insightful point that you make.
Oh yeah, so the crossover word is a word that has two meanings, and it's a word that is one of the meanings is kind of a is a well understood common definition of a word. So racism is a good example, because racism is when you discriminate against someone according to, the color of their skin or their race, or you treat them unequally according to those characteristics. But racism, of course, is well, actually, no. I prefer critical. Critical is a better crossover word, partly because of the discussion we were just having before, and critical thinking. So anyhow, it's
well,
a word.
and diversity too has there's positive, negative, and neutral words probably. So racism is a crossover word that goes from negative specific to negative general. It goes from the individual act of racism to systemic racism. Diversity starts as a positive side of let's be inclusive, but then eventually it becomes retributive and equitable, or whatever that means.
Yeah.
And then a neutral term like critical.
Yeah. Except that I think critical. This is why it's really a good example of a crossover word, and why it's one of the most effective. Is that so? The characteristics of the crossover words is that they're well understood. Typically, for common definitions, they're positive sounding, and they're not overly technical. So critical is it especially to academics. If you train people to be critical thinkers, and so being critical is really important, and it's really good. And so if someone when you so you have these that's what these crossover words have, these double meanings. So in the case of critical, you have the commonly understood meaning, and then you have the woke meaning. And the woke meaning is the critical social perspective, critical social justice perspective meaning, which is, you need to be critical, and by being critical, then you're aware, or you adhere to the three axioms. That knowledge is socially constructed, and those three different things. So that's what critical means. That's the other side of it. Of the crossover words. So the crossover words are all like that. They're words that you could use in regular conversation, and they could just float by. And if you weren't attuned to the perspective, you wouldn't even notice them. And if you did notice them, then you'd just be like, that's a weird time to use that word.
Yeah, again, this highlights a weakness, or kind of not a hypocrisy, but a failure of social justice, critical social justice, insofar as it's trying to make equity, and so far as trying to include people. It depends so much on high verbal skills and adherence to cues that are incredibly socially complex, and all these hints, all this spy stuff. So people with not necessarily low verbal intelligence, but somebody who's more Aspergery or autistic spectrum, who really needs these
it's interesting, yeah.
really solid, stable categories in order to adapt to the social environment, is completely disadvantaged by the entire just way that this stuff works. And eventually they either get swallowed by it, or completely confused by it, or kind of shoved out of it, and because they do all these faux pas, especially with the gender stuff. There's a lot of people who have even just like minor amounts of brain damage with regards to lingual properties, not being able to remember pronouns and stuff. And when you misgender somebody, means the execution of you from a position, like there's very little humanity in this because of the way that it's set up, just on a lingual level. Sorry for another aside.
Oh, no, that's good. But it reminds me, and it came up before, I was going to mention it, but we went off on something else. But I've heard situations where it looks like these enforced statements where people have to declare their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that they seem to have a strange effect, which is decreasing diversity, because the people who are able to really communicate it well have a very narrow cultural background, and from the right cultural background, but also from the right schools, and so it's having this strange effect that it's the effort to enforce diversity might actually be leading to a homogeneity.
Yeah.
So that's another puzzle.
You have a measured ending toward the end. You're not completely black-pilled, but you're very realistic. And you say, something to the effect of, okay, here's some tools. Here's the way to look at it. Here's the way to see it. Here's what it's doing, and then here's how to counter it if you so desire. And you probably should if you don't want the end result. But it's not going to happen overnight. This stuff has been going on, and you point to Gramsci and the prison notebooks. Gramsci was he was a communist, an Italian communist, and he expanded communism into the cultural domain, if that's fair to say.
That's right. Yep.
And then one of his acolytes or cohort people developed the term the long march through the institution. So the momentum
I think that comes quite late, right? The long march through institutions, because I was looking into it. I was curious about that, and I'd always associated it with Gramsci too.
Yeah.
And it seems to be
or something. I was just looking at that.
It's a German name, like Duschke or something, Rudi Duschke, and he was a student radical in the 1960s. I think he was the one who used it, but that's the ideas and the sentiment seem to go back to Gramsci and his prison notebooks, and so yeah. I mean,
so
I'm not noticing.
Insofar as this is going to take a lot of work, do you think that the alternative would be to let it crash and burn and develop other institutions, or do you think the institutions are salvageable or savable?
Oh, I don't know. I don't have a straight answer for it. I think so. We were talking earlier before about Yuval Levin, and we talked about his book, The Great Debate. But he had a book, a more recent book, and in fact, I read The Great Debate after having read the book that came out afterward called A Time to Build. And so a lot of Levin's work is really, the Great Debate, I think, is an interesting story about his view on things, which is ultimately the Burkean approach, which is, we have these institutions that exist. They've developed over a long time. They can be improved. We should improve them, but we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, ultimately. And the Thomas Paine, at least, in the Great Debate, was no, we have to take down the institutions and reform things from the bottom up. And so I think everybody probably feels, I certainly feel from time to time, a nihilistic urge to just tear the universities down, let them
disrupt
collapse.
And dismantle.
Yeah, exactly. Disrupt and dismantle. And sometimes it seems like that's the only way for a positive solution. But at the same time, it's difficult to be criticizing the critical social justice perspective and then take that approach as well. So I intellectually, when I think about it, I feel like, no, we have these institutions, they've been around for an awful long time. There are problems with them. They change over time. And my job or my responsibility as someone who's within the institutions is to try to change them from within. Mm-hmm. And I don't, that's how I want to be. It's not that sometimes I don't just get completely frustrated and think, we have to tear them down and start new universities. Because sometimes I think that too. It's not straightforward, but I think intellectually where I am is that's a better role to play. And Yuval Levin, he talks about that too in A Time to Build, that the responsibility of people is to try to work from the inside and not to destroy institutions, but to help build them, A Time to Build. Mm-hmm. And so I like that philosophically and theoretically, even though I don't always feel that way when I get up in the morning and read my Twitter feed or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, it depends on what side of the bed we wake up on. Let the world burn, or start to try to salvage, be the firefighter, or just wait for the earth to reemerge.
Or maybe the right image is those people in Iraq when they were putting out the fires at the oil in the oil fields, where so how they put out the fire. So when Saddam left, he set all the oil wells on fire, and so how they put them out?
Just throw bathwater and babies on them until?
No. So this is the thing: is that you had to. They went in, and then they put out this dynamite, and they'd have this huge explosion that would use up all the oxygen, and then they'd stop burning, and then they could cap them again. And so, anyhow, I was just kind of playing on your analogy,
that's what I was kind of intimating with regards. That's what I was kind of intimating with regards to the opportunist. Maybe there's one way of trying to see, well, can I change them? I can't really build another incentive structure until we get control of the incentives now with regards to the money, but we can weaponize them to just eat up all the oxygen, right? I mean, you could use certain people. I mean, this is spycraft. I mean, it gets really cynical where you're like, okay, if we're gonna have to do some controlled demolition at this point, if you want to go down that route, and then you're gonna have to kind of ends justify the means to a certain degree in order to.
Yeah, so that's what I've thinking about these things, and the counter Wokecraft that I suggest is I included the ones that I thought I could justify
with your ethics.
Exactly. And especially if you're going to criticize one ethical system, you can't adopt their ethics in your own. And so maybe that's naive, but
you do that. You actually, there's one part where there's one thing where you say adopt the woke terminology in order to counter it later down the road. Like in one section, you talk about adopting the rhetoric, but then putting things in place to counter that. But then you also say that, but now you have that rhetoric in place.
Yeah, exactly. So that was almost cautionary, and it was something that James had suggested putting in the book, and I put a cautionary note on it saying that I've heard that people have done this, and they basically they take advantage of this. I mean, in the particular example, it was a department. And they wanted to, I can't remember exactly how it worked, but basically they wanted to have a history of Marxism or something. Yeah. And then the person said, yeah, sure, no problem. And then the course was about the history of the atrocities under these Marxist regimes.
Or they included that aspect of
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but the cautionary aspect of it is by letting the rest of it go by, then the infrastructure's there. Mm-hmm. And so you can subvert the infrastructure, but the infrastructure is still there. So to me, it's a little bit of a dangerous ploy.
The other problem with the scale of this problem that we're talking about and the long march through the institutions and how much historical momentum it has is that we can't, even if we wake up tomorrow and we dismantle wokeness from all the institutions, there will be thousands of people out of a job and billions of dollars of resources just open because of the way that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have swept through the nation. It's $1 billion industry. There's so many people that are reliant on that. Short of, as soon as if we turn the ship around, there's going to be a lot of people that will be dispossessed. All those arts majors, all those critical social justice trainers, like they have no other skill in life other than to promulgate this through the universities. So what do we even do with them? Like, learn to code? Is that what you say? Just learn to code? I mean, they will be absolutely up in arms. And because they already have a bunch of friends in the New York Times, in these journal things, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen without like a major pushback on that front.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. It's embedded, and there's momentum, and definitely.
A lot of people rely on it.
Yeah. I just want to come back to one thing before about universities and tearing down institutions, but there was also one of the things that you mentioned, or maybe I mentioned it, was starting other institutions. Yeah. And so I think that is an interesting alternative, actually. And you'll have heard of UATX, and there's also Ralston College, where Stephen Blackwood, who's kind of started a university. And so one of the things that I think is because I think there is a demand for a kind of a regular university, where people just want to go to school and learn stuff and not be indoctrinated and not be what's the word that they use with the terrorists, that when they get
Is it
turned.
turned? Yeah.
No, it's not turned. There's a not activated, something like that. Anyhow, so students, there's a lot of people out there who don't want to have that happen, and there's certainly a lot of parents who would like to have their kids go to school and not have them come home at Thanksgiving and declare that they're going to destroy the patriarchy or whatever. So I think that there's a demand for that, but one of the problems related to that is how complicated it is to start a university and the incumbents that are there. So basically, all the universities that are there that are woke are going to make it very difficult for new universities to come and compete with them ultimately. So that's another angle.
It's just like what's playing out in the media space, whereas you have the mainstream media and then a lot of people that want something else, and then you have YouTube coming along with all these independent creators, which are gobbling up. I mean, Rogan blows the pants off of everybody else with regards to media, but then YouTube starts to get paid off by the institutions, and all of us independent content creators kind of push down in the algorithm, and then MSNBC, CNN, and Fox go right back up because they have so much vested interest already. So it's really difficult unless you, I think you start small and you get engaged on a local level, or you seek independent-minded people. Again, you seek people who are comedians, you seek people who are kind of anti-establishment, even if they work for an establishment, people who are resistant to group thinking and finding those within the institutions, and also supporting people who are creating independent content or who are going out on a limb to speak out about this stuff, and forming safety nets for those who are at threat of getting canceled in order for them to maintain and promote good work or good content or whatever it is.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's really the capturing of institutions. But I think, I mean, Substack, for example, YouTube has. It seems like there's stuff going on, but I think Substack remains relatively free of a lot of those types of incumbent capturing situations, and there appears to be a groundswell of support for people on those. I mean, the big ones I can think of are Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss.
The big ones,
yeah. And so I think there's hope there.
Benjamin Boyce, James Lindsay.
I was going to say, I didn't
distance.
I didn't want to try to charm the interviewer, but I was thinking it. And so I think that there's an interesting kind of almost a Schumpeterian. Joseph Schumpeter. He's an economist, famous for. Yeah, so his whole thing was creative destruction. That's Schumpeter. And so creative destruction is how capitalism works and how economies work and flourish, is that you have new ideas, new people come in to provide, and then they kind of take over and replaces lots of things, and then eventually they'll get replaced as well. But I think that that's a good model to think about for universities, for new media, all that type of stuff.
Again, there's problems with the different metaphors we use with regards to virus, with regards to mental health disorders, and but there's also positive benefit. The other metaphor that's used is the church metaphor, and if you analyze the woke as fulfilling some sort of religious, or fulfilling something that religion used to fulfill, once you pinpoint what is fulfilling, then really the challenge is to do something better, or is to see what the need it's meeting and meet that need better. I mean, that's the capitalist entrepreneurial tactic. That's the creative disruption. You replace that with something better. And so if I go far enough, there might be a possibility of replacing social justice or critical social justice in such a way, like swapping out the gold, like Indiana Jones does, with something that's actually gold, taking the crap and replacing with...
That was awesome. I totally saw that.
But if you do that, then all the people who are in these positions of power, they can kind of switch. You allow them to softly switch their allegiance without having to completely sacrifice everything that they spent their lives on. They don't have to necessarily sacrifice all this stuff. there might be a small possibility of doing that. I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for a larger question down the road. I don't even know if it's possible, but there might be.
But that's what my wife always says too, because we've had long conversations about all this stuff, and she's at first it's it's taken years. We've been having this. That's what she's been saying, is you have to provide a positive sounding alternative, and you can't just criticize. You have to find this alternative, and I'm not sure what that alternative is. And it's also the danger of that, of course, is just replacing one positive sounding but nefarious solution with another one. And I don't know the best way to do that. But I don't like either, because often, the early postmodernists, they would always, they'd be criticized for this too. Well, you're always criticizing. What are you going to do about it? And they said, well, my job isn't to do anything about it. My job is to criticize it. And so I don't really want to be that person either, but I'm not sure what the solution is.
Yeah, that reminds me of that. It's brought up periodically in culture war discourse where Jon Stewart owns Tucker Carlson like 20 years ago or something like that. And, or he goes on Fox, and Fox people are like saying, well, he's criticizing Fox for being entertainment, not news. And Fox is like, well, what are you doing? And he's like, well, my job as a comedian, I'm not here to like make the news, even though that's all he did was do political commentary dressed up as news. Right. So he,
and that's why people watched it actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He just disowned responsibility so he could have his cake and eat it too. Yeah. And I think insofar, sorry to go on another tangent, but I think that Tucker Carlson said, oh yeah, that's how I do it. And now he's the better Jon Stewart than The Daily Show. His show's better than The Daily Show, just with regards, even if you hate him, the content that he's producing is much more funny because he's going against the establishment in the way that Stewart did. Even if you disagreed with Stewart back in the day, they had the upper hand because they're the underdog.
Yeah.
And the underdog takes that tact and could be much more funny and snarky than the one who's in power.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so crazy to imagine 20 years ago watching Jon Stewart that Jon Stewart was going to be the establishment and the establishment enforcer. It's like so weird.
I think he might not have. I haven't watched his new special, but definitely Stephen Colbert is the torch bringer bearer. Mm. So. With regards to things that don't have anything to do with social justice and critical social justice, is there something, and I guess you can even go back to spying, what's the hobby that you do in the real world that you don't mind like sharing, like a passion project that you have or some sort of place where you seat your attention that's not in this realm?
Well, I'll tell you that, so this isn't my day job, right? Like, this is what I do as a passion, and it's not even a passion I chose. I feel like it was a passion that was imposed on me. So that, I mean, if I were to be honest, that's probably the main passion I've felt in the past few years. But I do have another one that maybe your listeners will like. I have a cottage, and I like using a chainsaw and clearing brush and woods and cutting trees and all that sort of stuff.
Creative destruction.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I'm allowing the trees to prosper more by cleaning them out.
Huh. How many acres do you have that you get to tend?
8 acres.
Okay. So there's always something to do back there then, huh?
Oh yeah, definitely. And then there's also so it's pretty dense woods, and I'm trying to transition the forest to be more a deciduous forest than an evergreen forest, because with solar heating it helps to in the winter, if you have if you have more deciduous trees and fewer evergreens, then you can get the solar heating be more effective. In
my state, it's really difficult to do anything with your land because Washington State is so lords over anything that has like more than 3 inches of rainwater for more than 5 days. They call it wetlands, and then you can't touch it and stuff. So it's really hard for
it's
people
very
to
restrictive.
do much with their property in this area.
Yeah, no, we don't have. It's not. So, I it's controlled, definitely, but it's compared to the city, for example. Where I live in the city, if you need to cut a tree down in your backyard, you have to go to City Hall, and they make you, it's a real headache. But where we are in the woods, it's not as difficult. And yeah, pretty hands off, actually. Yeah, a fire burning license regularly. They seem to care more about that than just about anything else. But but yeah.
Oh, we have a license. We just have with regards to fires, we just have a period. Or what are they called? Like a burn ban? That's what we have.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, no, we have permits, and you have to, they tell you sometimes, yeah, they're de facto periods when you can't burn, but it's seasonal. So it's red, yellow, or blue.
Yeah.
If it's blue, then,
Fun. Well, Charles, your book is amazing. I'm going to promote the heck out of it. It's available on Amazon. Is there other places where it's available right now?
No, it's just Amazon. Yeah, just New Discourses. I didn't have any say in all that, and so they've been doing it through Amazon, and it's available electronically. Kindle. There's a new Kindle version actually that just came out, the kind that you can search and change the font sizes and everything, and then it's in paperback. But,
it's incredibly useful. I recommend people read it and get 2 copies, and then just kind of very cleverly place a copy within reach of somebody who might want to be a little bit more dissident with regards to this kind of Wokecraft.
Well, I've got a lot of ideas for upcoming posts from having talked with you.
Okay, so with regards to that, how do people check up and read up on you and follow you?
Oh, well, yes, I'm on Twitter, Woke Dissident on Twitter. I have a blog that I maintain. It's woke-dissident.github.io. And those are the
You truly are STEM. You use GitHub and not Substack.
Well, I mean, I've been thinking, because I started this before Substack had come out, and I think, and actually one time I did try, I moved over to WordPress, and then I got messages from people saying it was too hard to find articles and this and that, but it's not very sophisticated looking. It's really just hand-coded HTML, and so it's not fancy. And I've been thinking, maybe Substack. I have to do that.
Polish up, just a little bit of polish. Well, thank you for your time. Thanks for working on this, and thanks for the discourse, the back and forth. It was a really engaging conversation for me.
Oh, well, thanks for the great questions. I learned a lot, and I found it fascinating.
Great exchange. I will end the recording.